我母亲当年在龙江大地开着它开荒种地。
到了11的时候，装上火车向北京天安门献礼。
这个工地是从无到有一步步建起来的，看到它建起来了，我们心里也很高兴。
超级计算机作为国之重器，能够使得我们国家更快地实现现代化。
花园挑花带动了我家经济条件，也解决了很多妇女的就业问题。
洱海水做清了，大米买了，我们才会有可持续发展。
Chinese contribution is not limited to what needs to be done within China.
The most important thing in the development is the people.
This will be written about by historians in the centuries to come.
Hey, welcome to CGTN Special Forum on China's modernization and the world. I'm Li Qiuyuan.
And I'm Zhong Shi. On October 16th, the Communist Party of China kicked off its 20th National Congress. The political event is held once every 5 years and provides a glimpse into China's future. Xi Jinping delivered a report highlighting the word modernization.
That's right. Today we want to look at China through the lens of modernization and explore how does China fit into the trajectory of modernization worldwide and how China has evolved to construct its own version of modernity. And
Absolutely.
Of course, its global implication.
Definitely. We will also take a look at how the rest of the world is modernizing and ask if there are different paths to modernization.
And we've got a great panel today. We're now joined on set by Mr. Wang Yao, founder and chair of the think tank Center for China and Globalization. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Wang. And Professor Xia Lu, associate professor at the School of Marxism Study at the Renmin University of China. Good to see you here.
And joining us online today, John Milligan White, executive chair of the America-China Partnership Foundation. Welcome. Alessandro Teixeira, professor of public policy at the School of Public Policy and Management at Tsinghua University and former Brazilian Minister of Tourism and of Development, Industry, and Foreign Trade. Welcome, Professor. We also have Carrie Brown, Professor of Chinese Studies at King's College London. Appreciate you joining us. Last but not least, Mr. Kofi M. Akuwaku from the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. Welcome, everyone.
And before we get started, we went out on the street to ask people, what do they think about China's modernization drive? Our question to them is, how modernized do you think China is? Have a look.
China is a country that has such a beautiful and great history.
China is very big and has a lot of technology.
The first thing that comes to my mind when I hear the name China, infrastructure, technology is another thing.
Shanghai, loved it.
China é país que antigamente era muito atrasado.
They're really culturally aware of what's going on in the world.
How modern do you think China is?
China is very modern.
Maybe not as modern as some other countries.
I haven't been there myself, but I hear that's pretty modern.
Modern? I think they're relatively modern.
Some part of China is like pretty underdeveloped, and some parts are well developed and well kept.
Well, obviously true, and people's opinions are varied on this topic. Since we're talking about China's modernization today, it's only fitting we get to know what people think. And I want to start our discussion with Mr. Wang Yao here in the studio. You deal with a lot of foreign colleagues on a daily basis. I'm pretty sure this has come up a lot in your conversations. What do you think? What do they think? What have they told you about China's modernization? Where is China?
Well, that's right. I think now they have, we often talk to many foreigners and friends and also in China, but basically they can see there's modern China. If you go to Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, those coast area, perhaps those skyscrapers and all those modern skylines, you can definitely see a very modern China. But also you have to remember also on the other hand, we have a vast West, we have all those interior provinces. We still got 300 million migrant workers.
Absolutely.
And a few hundred million farmers. So still, there's several China. Probably have a modern aspect of it, but also there's a median range of it. There's also a backward of China. So you have to really look at the different lenses and have a different conclusions. But in general, I think people recognize China has really made a lot of progress, particularly infrastructure. I think that's really modernized China. For example, in the last decade, the speed railway, this bullet train has doubled and tripled in China. So that's incredible. That's one of the symbols of the modern transportation China has.
There is no going around the fact that there are regional differences, and Mr. Wang mentioned just now, urban-rural differences, east-west differences. Let me also get the thoughts from Mr. Kuwaku here. Sir, what is your impression of the modernity of China?
Well, I must say most of us have been extraordinarily impressed. In fact, I would qualify it as a hyper-modernization, because there are a couple of elements that really qualify and governs that. The first one is the scale of it. The size is so huge with a large population. But most important, the nature of that kind of modernization has some sense of imprint that's the urgency, the speed of it. It's just almost exponential right across. Things are just happening so fast, and it's changing China the way that we've never seen before. And it's not just changing China, but also having a huge impact on our continent in Africa, where Chinese footprints of, it's not just economic element, but the economic investment and then all of that come with a form of modernization. It starts in the mind. It's also designed, planned, and executed well. And we've seen through the Belt and Road Initiative that the kind of infrastructure that China is building in Africa is bringing with it a large sense of modernization.
Speed and pace really is a highlight and a key word in our discussions today, but we'll also be exploring the next phase of China's development. One more question to Mr. Milligan White. I want to get your thoughts also on this topic about China's modernity at this stage, at this point.
I've been living in Beijing since 2008, and I share the amazement of my friend from Africa. The development in a single lifetime of China is unprecedented in its speed, scope, and impact on the world, and it is extremely impressive. New way to look at the whole process of how the developing countries can also modernize in order to catch up to the developed countries.
But Professor Brown, when we speak about modernity or modernization, is there a universally recognized criteria when you look at how modernized a country is? What kind of measurements will you be looking at?
Yeah, actually, as people were talking, I was just looking at definitions of modernity, because it's a phrase that gets used a lot, but I actually don't think there is a kind of universal definition. It certainly means embracing new technologies, so China's certainly done that, especially infrastructure changes, so the huge high-speed train rails that China's built, I think 35,000 kilometers so far, which is more than the rest of the world put together. It means embracing kind of new forms of social organization. Individualism, so I suppose you do see individualism with Chinese characteristics in China, so it means kind of adapting this universal template to kind of local conditions, which I think has always been the sort of argument in China, that it is adapted and made for local conditions. But I suppose the thing that is most interesting is also looking beyond traditional ways of thinking. So there, I suppose it's interesting, China is sort of trying to do something slightly different, because it's certainly now not jettisoning its traditional understanding of its culture and history, but trying to create something quite hybrid. So I suppose that's its contribution, that modernity has been seen before probably as something quite uniform and maybe standardized. If you have it in one country, you kind of have to copy that template in others up to a certain degree. But I think China's trying to do something which is probably quite unique in terms of underlying belief systems, and also the sort of shape of modernity and how it uses traditional ways of thinking. Because of course in China, history is extremely rich and complicated and deep.
Which has brought me to another interesting question. And Professor Teixeira, let me bring you into this conversation. Is industrialization equal to modernization when you look at it? Is this the only way to lead to modernization? For example, can an agrarian economy reach modernization ultimately? What do you think?
First, I think we need to understand a little deeper the concept of modernization, because you have economic modernization is one thing, you have social modernization is another thing. And when we analyze, for example, the Chinese concept of modernization, it's different from the Western economies. For example, in the Western world, if you can standardize, that is very difficult. There is different analysis and different concepts what's to be modernized. One of the concepts in the Western means that you need to be industrialized. It needs to be industry. But this is not a modern concept. Since Karl Marx in the first phase of the Industrial Revolution, we are talking that an economy that is developed is modernized because they have industries. And that's not exactly the case. So the proxy for modernization nowadays is technology. So of course you have countries that can rely on agriculture. And also, if we take the concept of modernization from the economic lens, you're going to say to add technology to agriculture. So that's the big discussion in terms of development path. I think when President Xi Jinping in China define the uniqueness of modernization, they are talking two levels. One is the social concept of modernization, looking at the Chinese socialism characteristics and the values that this society have. For example, the discussion about individualism versus collectivism. There is a big debate in the ideological scene on that. And the other side is the modernization to economy that is different as well from the Western, because brings the concept of common prosperity as a society as a whole. So I think this conversation and this debate on modernization, we don't have the same and standard concept from the Western to the Chinese. Chinese is a complex 5,000 year society, so we need to be very careful how we define modernization and how this has implications to the Chinese modernization path.
Let me just pick up the points mentioned by both professors just now. There probably isn't a universal definition, and I don't think there is a single numerical definition to what modernization really is. But for those people that have said, oh, I think China is pretty modern, they probably are impressed with China's economic performance over the past few decades. I want to direct your attention now to China's GDP growth over the past 4 decades. Let's take a look at this chart here. These are some critical years involved here, starting with 1978, where China's GDP figure stood at just 0.37 trillion yuan. That was the year when China really started to implement the reform and opening up policy.
A massive plan. Then you see 1990. This is when you see the inception of Chinese stock market, another momentous moment for Chinese economy. Not a whole lot of growth there, but steadily climbing.
And then we have 2001. This is another critical year for China, as it was at that time that China joined the World Trade Organization. Following that is this sharp rise in economic volume and growth, indicating how interactions with the rest of the world are, which we will touch upon later on our forum today.
Really a critical watershed moment here, transformative for the Chinese economy, which accelerated everything, right?
Absolutely. And then fast forward to 2021, you see the GDP figure had surpassed 110 billion yuan. I mean, these are critical years, these are critical numbers. But then for people that are saying, well, this is how China has developed its economy over the past few decades, they are also keenly aware that China is transitioning now. We talked about how speed and pace were the key words for China's economic growth during the past few decades. But now it looks like China is transitioning into a new mode of development, maybe slower growth, but higher quality development. So Professor Brown, I want to come back to you. We're talking about China's modernization now, but it is going into the next phase, the next stage. What will China's economic growth look like going from here?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the kind of big challenges for China in the reform and opening up period after the sort of late 1970s was you could have very high growth, and certainly for 20, 30 years, there was very, very high growth, sometimes double digit. But it really depended on the quality of growth. And so very fast industrialization kind of sometimes had a huge toll on the environment and also created inequality. So there's been a lot of attention to those two things in particular and sustainability of growth. And now I think we saw in the 20th Party Congress over the last week in Beijing a lot of talk about innovative China, so enormous amounts of investment. And this is under the 14th five-year plan, so that was from a couple of years before, into research and development. I mean, something like 6% of GDP, and attempts to really make China innovative in new technologies. In some areas, it's already made big strides. So artificial intelligence, some life sciences. I mean, there's other areas where it really wants to probably be more forward and maybe more autonomous. So this is a big historic shift, because I think until now, China's innovation and its record of research has not been noted. But I think now the world needs to take China's aspirations seriously.
Profound changes.
Very significant amounts of investment in. Thanks.
Right, but Professor Xia here, what I find most intriguing is that China has been able to compress centuries of Western development into just a few decades. How did China make it? What makes it possible for China to achieve this?
Well, first of all, it is the international context. The international context, actually, when we look back to even 150 years ago, when China was still in a kind of late Qing period in late 19th century and early 20th century, China was not in a very kind of favorable international context, because back then China was kind of invaded by other country and exploited by other country, and this kind of international kind of context was dominated by a trend of colonialism and imperialism. In that kind of context, I would like to say that a very, very poor and very backward country, if they really wanted to do some kind of modernization attempt, well, the international context was not in their hand, was not in their kind of, it was not in their hands. So China should first, secure the safety of the society and the safety of the people, and then can move on to modernization. Well, when we look back to the more than 4 decades, 4+ decades, these kind of experiences, we should see that there are 2 miracles. The first miracle is the high kind of a growth rate, like you just mentioned, according to the statistics. And the second miracle is just the long time of the social stability. And this social stability, we could argue that it is also, on the one hand, it is a result of the modernization. On the other hand, it provides a very stable and kind of a secure, context for China to experience or to enjoy this high speed, growth. So that would be kind of a different timing for the development and different circumstances for the development. And this is like what Professor Koshenko of Harvard University argued, that it couldn't be copied but could be learned. So that's the timing of the development, and this is critical even for catch-up developing countries like China.
A very unique Chinese way, and that's probably when the statesmen back then in China realized that a whole mimicking of Western ways of modernization, industrialization might not be the answer for the Chinese problem.
And the central leadership Mr. Xiao was talking about came with the CPC coming to power. We often say that it was the Chinese people who chose the Communist Party of China. I want to get your take on what the CPC did correctly in terms of modernizing China. What did the Communist Party of China do right in this process, and how would you assess its leadership?
Well, first of all, of course, it had to have a very kind of stable situation. So the first step is to, change the old system or the old order, and instead, replace the old order with a new order. That order is a stable order. So that's the founding of the People's Republic of China, and then, well, to get China into its, to get modernization, used to China's real condition. For example, in the early stage of the PRC. Well, the central leadership of the People's Republic of China, they are young. They didn't have this kind of experience. So they tried to learn from the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union had already got more than 4 5-year plan before the Second World War. So they had to learn from the Soviet Union. However, just right after the first 5-year plan in 1957, Chairman Mao delivered a very important speech. That's on the 10 relations. And one of the relations he mentioned is the relation between the foreign experience and our own country's condition. So he focused more on China's critical or unique condition, social condition, that China still had a huge amount of rural residents working in the, rural residents and the peasants and this kind of thing. So China was still very backward in terms of the balance between the first industry industry, second industry, and the third industry. And also, China did not have a lot of resources back then. So Chairman Mao and his leaders and his generation of leaders tried to do something to, focus more on China's own kind of condition. And it was the same thing that the reform-minded leadership ever since 1978 did, right? So we can say that, crossing the river by touching the stone was a very kind of mimic description about this experience. And even for now, Chinese leadership was still trying to focus on China. And that is the sixth sticking up in this year's 20th National Congress report. So we can say that the deep code, or that one of the, successful deep code for the CPC's kind of success is to stick into China's own condition and combine foreign experience.
A very distinctive trajectory we've taken here, and that's how China got here today. But why don't we take a look at China's modernity today?
Absolutely.
The president has laid out a blueprint, right?
Let's take a look at that, what Chu-Yan mentioned here. Everyone is sort of clear on what happened to China, but people are curious in finding out what will happen to China's modernization going from this point. And the Communist Party of China said that Chinese path to modernization is going to help the nation achieve national rejuvenation. Mr. Xi Jinping called this the new central task of the party. Let's take a look at what the Chinese path to modernization entails. It is similar to modernization in other countries, but with Chinese characteristics.
Right, it's a modernization of a huge population. 1.4 billion people, accounting for about 20% of global population. Unprecedented before, the scope and scale of this kind of modernization. Never seen in human history, never seen elsewhere in the world.
And then it's modernization of common prosperity for all. I think this is a often very misconstrued concept because people wonder what really is common prosperity. Does it mean equal prosperity? Does it mean robbing the rich to help the poor?
And it's also a very timely question too, because we've seen a sharp increase in income disparity ever since the 1980s, right? And that has given rise to sort of social ills or social grievances, but the government now has seen it, is now taking action, and that's why we have seen this kind of proposal.
And then we have modernization of material and cultural ethical advancement. Obviously, we're not just talking about material wealth here, not just monetary achievements. We're also talking about people's mindset, their mental health, their spiritual pursuits.
And of course, modernization of harmony between humanity and nature, the relationship between mankind and nature. Green development has been for the first time written into the CPC Constitution. That's a remarkable change.
Yeah, it also signifies that in the next chapter of China's economic development, we should focus more on ecological conservation, environmental protection. No progress should come at the cost, at the sacrifice of the environment.
Ecological conservation ranks pretty high on China's modernization agenda.
And last but not least, modernization of peaceful development. That's self-explanatory. It's consistent with China's foreign policy of peace. Chu-Yan, why don't we delve into some of these points with our guests here?
What I find most interesting is common prosperity, right? Let me put that question to you, Mr. Wang. Explain to us what does it really entail? People say it's robbing the rich and helping the poor, but that's not it, right? It does not mean averaging it out for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that China has gone through the last 4 decades of lifting 800 million people out of poverty. I think that's something unprecedented in the history of mankind, and now we're entering into a new centenary goal now. So the challenge for China is how after 800 million, poverty alleviation, can we do another 300 million migrant workers in the city? Can we make them into a middle class? So after we have created a 400 middle class in China, 400 million middle class in China, can we have another 1 billion? What about the other 1 billion, still trying to be a middle class? So let's have another 400 million maybe in the next 10, 15 years. So there's quite a few goals of that. I think the common prosperity emphasized in China is important because we see in many other countries, this is really a very acute social problem. The gap between rich and the poor, the 1% of the elite really equal to massive population's wealth. And that's created the deglobalization, that's created all those social setbacks and all those problems we have. So I think China now really realized that, lift 800 million people out of poverty is not enough. That's just the basic. Now we need to do a bit more. So, 300 million migrant workers in the urban center, another several hundred million in the rural area. We could work together. So I think this is really a noble objective China is really trying to reach for the second centennial goal. So China has built the largest social safety net and largest education, largest health system.
A daunting task to say the least.
Yeah, but then how could we, not just basic, we need maybe even higher grade and upgrade on that. So I think there's a huge challenge for making this common prosperity, but avoid those deglobalization issues that we are facing, seeing in many other countries probably.
But Professor Teixeira, your thoughts on China's common prosperity, the concept of it, how plausible do you think is this goal?
I believe it's very plausible. The concept of common prosperity is the type of development that China chooses to go through. Common prosperity means the same as a proxy of high development process. When I think about common prosperity and when I see President Xi Jinping deliver different speeches and talk about common prosperity, what he says is that we need to have economic growth because development is not equal to economic growth. Development is much more. It's social justice, is environmental development, is everything comprised. That's the real development concept. It's not only economic development. So common prosperity means to improve the life of the citizens in China, to give better education, to give better health, to give the general standard of life. So that's what means common prosperity. And also showing, and again, Chinese model cannot be copied from the economic point of view, can be inspired, cannot be replicated, needs to be very clear. Why? Because development depends on institutions, depending on the system, depending on the culture. And the culture in China is different from other countries. The leadership and the governance system of China is different from other countries. Educational system is different from other countries. So China, yes, can inspire other countries, but cannot be copied because the settlement of the government, the leadership is different. So when I think about common prosperity, in the case of Chinese society, I think in social justice and economic growth with quality. So that's what means for me, and I think for people that study the economy of China.
Professor Kuwaku, when you look at China and the problem of common prosperity, I mean, if you take a look at the status now, there's deeply entrenched division between urban area and rural area. And in order to eradicate that kind of gap, might need bold reforms. But what's needed to be done urgently? What do you think?
It's an excellent question. But before I answer this question, I want to tackle something very quickly. I think the idea of modernization is, one of your guests said it's not quite new. In fact, it goes even much further than just the idea of Karl Marx and other people theorizing about it. When Zhang He was sailing on the ocean with his boats, I mean, these were some of the most marvelous technological invention and modern invention in those days. We haven't probably had a chance to really enjoy this. But even that was during the Ming period. But before that, 5,000 years ago, those transitions have happened. We just probably don't have seen the scale to which they've happened. So what we know is there are temporal elements that really qualify the idea of modernization of China. There's, of course, the past, what we can also call the hindsight view, and then the present, which we very close to the past 20 years. China is attempting to modernize away from urban centers to moving them to what we will call today rural. They may have different names, by building those very powerful railway lines. And we know, for example, that a couple of weeks ago, the maglev, the new train that's just breaking records, has now been invented to speed up the movement between rural and urban and vice versa. Will probably help to alleviate a bit of the urban congestion. But what is important is modernization. It's a flowing on any environment. But let me also close with this one. For us in Africa, I think it's important. And I agree with Professor Alessandro that there is no automatic link, assured link between modernization and development. and economic development will probably start to help push it a bit. If we've seen what we've learned in Africa, and we've seen is that, there have been modernization without development. And that the proof is everywhere to see, because Africa hasn't moved as fast as possible. There's a very small amount of people benefiting from it. So let me conclude with this one. The key for us, at least for me, and as I look at Africa, and in comparing a bit with China, is that the kind of modernization that China is talking about is deliberate, organized, and purposefully executed with plans. And in Africa, much of it is incoherent and not that yet there. But the most important benefit that we're getting, and at least the lesson from China, is it must be human centric. It must be based on human to benefit from those kind of modernization. It's not just on paper, building train for a few wealthy people, but extend it to both rural and then urban areas. And I think for me, that's the profound lesson that I want to take from China.
Which really speaks to the essence of China's modernization drive, which is the government-led but human-centered drive. Professor Brown, let me quickly get your take on what's been said there. Common prosperity equal to socialism? What do you think?
I'm not really here to make a political point. I think the expectations towards China in terms of the environment are big. And I mean, the good news is that it's pretty clear that the government in China are really committed to environmentalism. And in fact, I mean, when I looked at statements Xi Jinping had made when he was party secretary of Zhejiang in the early 2000s, he was extremely committed to environmentalism. So that's a good piece of news. But I mean, globally, the biggest challenge that we're facing is the environment. It's clear there were huge droughts this year in Europe, very savage hot weather in Chongqing and elsewhere in China. I mean, huge kind of impacts daily. And so governments working together, it's really important on this. For whatever their problems, the US and China, at least until recently on the climate change debate with John Kerry and his interlocutor in China, we're having a good and productive dialogue. And that's really, really important.
Yeah, and what earlier Mr. Milligan-White said was really a pretty neat segue into our next part of discussion, which is China's modernization and its impact to the world, right? As being the second most populous country in the world, or second most largest economies and the most populous country in the world, what happened here is bound to have global impact. And China says it wants to provide more opportunities as it pushes toward modernization. And here are some of the data. Take a look at this.
In recent years, China has become the biggest market for growth and destinations for foreign investment. In 2012, China's combined trade in goods and services ranked second in the world. And 10 years later, in 2021, that amount was up by more than 50%, with China ranking top for 2 consecutive years. Since 2017, China has been a global runner-up by the amount in inflow FDI, and it is tied among the global top 3 in terms of FDI outflow. Here I am at the Yanqi Lake International Convention Center. In 2019, the Second Belt Road Forum for International Cooperation was held right here. And since BRI was announced in 2013, 136 countries and 30 international organizations have signed on. Participating countries now represent 70% of the world's population. When it comes to tackling the public health crisis during the pandemic, China leads vaccine exports to the world, providing more than all other countries combined. The country also pledged to provide 2 billion vaccine doses globally and contributed $100 million to COVAX for vaccine distributions to the least developed countries. In the past 30 years, China has sent more than 40,000 personnel for UN peacekeeping operations, contributing to world peace.
Where China's modernization carries major significance to the world. After all, only less than 10% of the world population now have been industrialized. So if China can reach modernization, additional 20% of population can enter modern times, right? And along the way, Mr. Wang, China is going to ignite new growth opportunities across the world, right? In Asia, Europe, or even industrialized in the United States, isn't it?
Well, yes, I think the path to modernization of China is really a great inspiration probably for many other countries. For example, one of the very characteristic of China is also very unique, is that China really has a hybrid economy. So you have 60% of private sectors employs about 80 to 90% employment, and then you have another 20% of SOE, which does all the priority and the stabilizing, disaster relief, and all those national priority sectors. And then you have another 20% that's also, 40-50% of import and export. So this trilateral economy is really unique to China, and you don't see really in many other countries. So this hybrid economy, I think that's the characteristic like Chinese modernization actually enjoys for the last 4 decades. So I think that kind of a useful experiment could be really to other developed countries, can be probably learn something from China. But also on the other hand, I think the other thing China has done is really put a lot of emphasis on education. Chinese culture, traditionally emphasizes hugely on education, family values, and all those talent training. So China every year now produces 10 million college graduates. That's the largest in the world, and they have 3,000 universities across China. So I think education, human resource development, and then attracting foreign investment, open door, and then of course also we have this hybrid economy, could be the therapy for China's success. I think that's all. In addition to all the other factors, those are really good symptoms that China can be seen.
I just want to bring up another example where China is actively seeking to share the fruits and contents of its modernization. Mr. Kwaku, I want to come to you now for this one. The Belt and Road Initiative, since its inception in 2013, has seen close to 150 countries and over 30 international organizations sign on. World Bank data show that the initiative lifted over 7 million people out of extreme poverty, 32 million out of medium poverty. Mr. Kwaku, China says its modernization has been peaceful and it wants to share its modernization with the rest of the world. Right. Would you consider a massive mega project like the Belt and Road Initiative an example of China sharing what it has achieved in modernization?
You remember the old butterfly effects, the old butterfly effect that something happens in one place and then takes place a little bit later in another part of the world. So if we took that sort of example, and it seems like the old butterfly effect has been almost surpassed by what I would call the maglev effect, with magnetic levitation train effect. Anything that happens in China arrives in Africa so fast that we are now struggling to see how do you manage the impact and the potential risks to these kind of modernization elements. And so that comes to us, and I think with the growth of China and with the impressive numbers in extreme poverty reduction, Africans are also learning lessons about how do we go about doing that? How did China do it to make it so much so that they've managed to reduce all these issues? And it is the most critical issue in Africa, poverty alleviation. And I think we must manage it in a way that not just the risk, but the benefits are visible enough. And I think China and African leaders are doing so. But most important, what needs to be managed is the magnitude of the effect, because we're not quite sure how to do that on a continent that's not really used to seeing such humongous impact of great type of projects.
We've also collected some comments from social media about what people think of China's development and China's relations with the rest of the world. Let's take a look at this comment from YouTube. This user says, "We don't need war and weapons to be a power. Winning hearts and minds can do much more, and everyone profits from it. We don't have to pull others down to rise. It's the opposite. When we help others rise, we become much taller." China's philosophy, peaceful progress for all. When we try to gain profit from the misery of others, we all go down. It becomes a zero-sum game. This is essentially China's idea of a better world where the zero-sum game mentality is replaced by, building a community of a shared future for mankind. And Professor Xiao, let me talk to you about this. This is what China has been advocating. How well do you think it has been received in other parts of the world? What problems does this mentality solve?
Actually, this is also a very important question, because when we look back to the history of the international relation, so I always ask my students that when we talk about international relation, the current international order or the international rules, anything like this, no, did all these kind of concept like sovereign state, like the sovereignty, like the diplomacy, like the diplomat, like the consulate ever exist ever since? I mean, did this kind of concept exist for a long time? No, it did not exist until 17th century, mid-17th century, since 1648. That's the Westphalia Treaty. And since Westphalia Treaty got signed between the European countries, very small group of European countries that fought the 30-year war, and they signed this kind of treaty. They just want to settle down for the peace. And that was only international orders and the rules for the European countries or European sovereign states, not for all this kind of country. Because back then, in 17th century, even in 18th century, there were different world orders written by Henry Kissinger, his book World Orders. But nowadays, or ever since the First World War, Second World War, this kind of international orders originated from Western Europe, just got expanded to the rest of the world and accepted by the rest of the society, the international community. However, originally, it was not equal. Originally, it was not friendly to developing countries. Originally, it was not guaranteed the developing countries' rights. So that is why China, while suffering from the previous experience, when China entered the international order, it proposed that we should respect the sovereignty of different countries, whether they have big territory or not, whether they have a huge population or not, whether they have different kind of religion or not. We should all respect them in terms of they are sovereign countries. That's the first step. And then nowadays, ever since 2012, Chinese leadership also proposed the new international relation that is based on the peace and the cooperation and also the win-win. So there should be more zero-sum game for the 21st century, because 21st century saw the prosperity for the people. So we shouldn't use the old international order. That's the kind of the thing we should change. That's the thing.
Professor Brown, no political statement needed, but I just want to get your thoughts on what the feasibility of it all. I mean, the essence here is pretty straightforward. We are a global village. It takes a village to accomplish so many things here. China, obviously, as Professor Hsia was talking about, is speaking on behalf of the developing countries, but obviously it has in mind a lot more than just advocating for developing countries. The whole international community, in China's mind, should gear towards building a community of a shared future for mankind. But coming from China, is this message going to be accepted, especially in the West, Professor Brown?
Okay, I mean, I think on some issues like combating climate change, pandemics, kind of things about the sustainability, there's, I think, an understanding that if we don't solve these together, we're not going to solve them. But obviously, it's becoming quite a divided world over the last 5 years, certainly with trade wars and then with all sorts of other issues. It's not easy to get some cooperation going. So I think we just have to basically manage the constant issues, geopolitically and diplomatically between each other. I don't think we're going to be able to solve them. I mean, it's going to be a golden age for diplomacy, probably. But we don't have any choice about these big issues. We're going to have to work together. There is no choice. So thinking there is really rather strange. There is no choice.
And the Chinese people genuinely believe the countries can peacefully coexist and thrive as long as we are united and we help each other. That's deeply rooted in the Chinese philosophy, its culture, and its history. But for the next part of our discussion, we want to take a look at global modernization, right? Because only a few places have been fully industrialized. Right. So the progress is not uniform. It has not been progressed uniformly. If you look at Africa, Mr. Kawaku, unfortunately, it remains the least industrialized continent in the world, and with only one country being characterized as fully industrialized or industrialized, which is South Africa. And there's a general agreement that things has to change. But Africa continent as a whole, they are facing a unique set of problems, aren't they?
Yes, indeed. I think what is really exciting for most of us who've got into that generation from the 60s to here now is the hopeful attitude that something's going to change. And we've said, as a young man, I worked for the World Bank for many years. And one of the hopes was that we used to say that Africa was the last frontier. It was a bit bullish on our part, but I think it's coming clean because there is an opportunity to test a great deal of modernization on a vast continent that's about 30 million a little bit over 30 million square kilometers. There are pockets of modernization. South Africa is one of them. Things are happening also in Morocco. Things also, they picked up a bit in Libya, but Libya was destroyed. But the hope is that African leaders can get their act together and benefit from the kind of, proposals and ideas that are coming from China. And they must be tested as well. If they are tested properly in different places, people will be able to see. So empirical evidence must be provided for Africans. And I think China has been leading that. I wouldn't say away from the Europeans who've been here for more than 2 to 3 centuries. Most of us are asking ourselves when Europeans were saying, hey, the Chinese will come and colonize you. And we usually say in a sort of fun, poking way, so who was there before them? But clearly what we're looking for is, and I think I agree with Professor Brown, that this kind of diplomatic approach to working together.
Professor Teixeira, over to you. Latin America and the Caribbean, for a very long time, has been failed to reap additional benefits of participating in productive global value chain as opposed to Asia. And in recent years is seeing a decline in its economic importance. I mean, how do you see the growth prospects for this region?
Yes, again, I don't want to be the opposition in the debate, but we need to be very careful when we use the term modernization equal to industrialization. Why? Because my country, the largest economy in Latin America, industrialized its full potential in the 40s and the 50s. And since the 50s, we are in the middle income trap, okay? That is China arriving now. So we need to be very careful. Why? Because Brazil is a powerhouse in agriculture. It's the largest exporter of coffee, is the largest exporter of soybean, is the largest exporter of meat. So if we take the concept that, in my opinion, again, a concept that is misleading, and that's what happened in Latin America for many countries, the concept of the World Bank and IMF during the 80s was saying, stop agriculture development, stop your agriculture modernization, take everything you have in agriculture and put in the manufacturing industry. This didn't work for many countries in Latin America and didn't work for many countries in Africa because we cannot copy a model. The reality of UK, the reality of France, the reality of the United States is different from our countries. So to tell, the only way you can develop yourself is through manufacturing, low-cost labor. It's not the only way. We don't have an only way to modernize a country, to get the benefits for the population. That's a mistake. Other areas of the economy, and that's why I believe in China be leading the world economy, because it's leapfrogging in that area.
Very interesting points Professor Teixeira has raised there. A vivid example, which really speaks to the fact that there is diversity in modernization. There's not only way, right?
Right, and to echo a point from Professor Brown earlier, I mean, some of the biggest challenges of the day that we face together as a global community require concerted efforts, Chiu-Yet, and the imbalances that you pointed out in Latin America, in Africa, speak to the fact that when it comes to addressing and tackling some of the common issues together, individual countries' abilities and capabilities are different. What does that mean is that maybe we're going to need the stronger countries helping out the weaker ones. So Mr. Wang, let me come to you now. Do you think that countries with higher levels of modernization and development have an obligation and a duty to helping out, less developed, less modernized countries, as we're talking about addressing climate change, for example, global governance, for example, and even geopolitical conflicts in certain regions, for example?
Oh, absolutely. I think that that exactly, the world is actually being experienced in the last 7 decades. We always have a developed country, doing some help overseas development for developing countries. Now China actually gradually coming up to the ladder, and then China has to do some of that as well. So we want to avoid this Kinderberg trap, so that we want to provide a lot of global public goods. I think Belt and Road is one example, but of course there's AIB, there's China also harness its biggest application for the solar panel energy and wind powers, and of course the biggest EV car market. So I think all those technologies eventually will have to benefit the world as well. So I think that China is in this kind of position and has to really make more commitment, more obligations now to the world, rather than we take a ride on the globalization on the WTO, but now it's time to contribute and then to really stabilize the world and help the developing countries. The global South is really left behind. So I was really proposing like let's have a G3, China, EU, and the US with global South. Let's really working with global South. And there's a lacking of plans, lacking of incentive, lacking of master minding for that. I think China has done something, but we need all other big countries work together to really help the global South to develop.
Yeah, on the topic of diversity and allowing for different paths to coexist at the same time, I believe we have another interesting comment we'd like to share with you. Also, this one also a comment on social media. Would the US allow this free competition of ideas? They are more likely to try to destroy China than to allow people to freely choose between their system and China's. Let's also mention that we've recently had a CGTN survey where 5,000 young people in 30 countries show that about 85% of the respondents believe that a country should choose its own development path based on its national conditions, and that there's no universal standard for modernization. I mean, we've said a lot of nice things about China's path to modernization, but make no mistake, we're not advocating that each and every other country in the world should follow in China's footsteps.
Right.
We're simply pointing out that individual countries should be allowed to choose a path most pertinent and suitable to their own conditions.
Mr. Milligan-White, let me get your take on this. I mean, China's story of modernization kind of busted the myth that one country can only reach modernization the Western way. But how do you think for example, the United States will be looking at this story?
In 2007, I was one of the founders of the America-China Partnership Foundation in New York. And we did that because we saw what was coming, which is what we've been discussing tonight. And when we asked leading Americans, the leading American in Congress, who was China's biggest critic, he said that he completely agreed with the thesis of our various books that China and America would have to become partners. And the managing editor of the New York Times said that America and China will have to become partners, and that no one in the American think tanks at that time could have written books about how exactly you align the American and Chinese economies' growth and their national security. And we were astounded. So Larry Summers recently pinpointed the key problem. He asked, could the United States imagine a viable global economy in 2050? When the United States economy was half the size of the world's largest? Could an American political leader acknowledge that reality sufficiently to discuss what such a global economy would look like? And he added, the United States may not find it acceptable to be outdistanced economically so much, but we can't stop China without inviting conflict. So around 2018, the American think tanks and policymakers realized that China wasn't kidding about made in China in 2025 and going for technological innovation worldwide. And the first reaction was to attempt to compete in a zero-sum sort of way. What I have suggested to the China Institute for Innovation and Development Strategy is that there has to be a group formed, a quiet, low-profile group with leading American think tank and policy people, retired, to work out exactly what a viable global economy would look like in 2050 when the American economy is only half the size of the world's largest economy. And I think that is critical. And China has to take a leadership role in that initially, because for precisely what Larry Summers mentioned, it has to reach out quietly to the Americans and put a group together that begins working on what we do the next time the global capital and credit markets stop operating, as they did in the week of September 17th, 2008, because we're not going to be able to use central bank stimuli to get ourselves out of it. The only thing that will get us out of it is a unexpected 2 or 3 page agreement between the presidents of the United States and China, setting out that they will never have a war and that they're going to basically align their economic and military national security in a framework agreement, which doesn't need Senate approval. That president-to-president agreement is the whole new direction for a viable world in the future.
And being able to appreciate the diversification in modernity or modernization, I mean, how important is that for global development? What kind of significance does it carry to the international community?
Well, remember, there are those in the world that thought that a country could only succeed if it copied basically a Western or European American model. And it's a shock to find out that a country can succeed faster than anyone in the world has ever succeeded, on a scale larger than anyone in the world has ever done. In one of the poorest countries in the world still, you have a developing country that is, in a way, the leader of the developing and the developed world. So it will take time for people in the developed world to get over their shock, their cognitive dissonance about how they, if you read The Economist magazine will say, well, just China's success won't last. Well, it hasn't been lasting now for about 40 years. They will get used to the fact that it not only lasts, but with the new innovations that China is focusing on, China is going for world leadership in 7 of the 8 major new technologies. So it will take about 10, 15 years. And China has to really assiduously reach out and form internal, it has to change the agenda of what the think tanks in Europe and America talk about.
Absolutely. And what will the global status quo look like by then? I guess we shall see. But
we'll be watching for sure.
Yeah, China has found its own version of modernity, as we've been discussed in the past hour or so. And it has been able to transform the country, lifting people out of poverty and transform large parts of the country from poverty to prosperity, which really speaks to the fact that there is diversity in modernity. The way it works for you might fit or might not fit with other types of modernity that has already been established elsewhere in the world, and it's absolutely okay.
And in terms of China, what's crystal clear from the just concluded Party Congress is that China's modernization is an ongoing, continuous, open-ended process. One thing for sure is that China will not stop its modernization going forward. That is why we should all be watching.
That is all the time we have, I guess. Thank you very much, our guest, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Welcome. Bye-bye.